The deed to 300 acres of good Colorado grassland had sat in Seth Finley's saddlebag for 11 months, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth, and he had never once set foot on the land it described. He had been riding for most of those 11 months, taking work where he could find it, driving cattle up through New Mexico territory, mending fences for ranchers outside of Pueblo, sleeping under a canvas tarp when the boarding houses were full. He was not a drifter by nature. He was a man who had simply not decided what to do with the weight of what had been left to him, and so he had kept moving, the way a man will sometimes keep moving when standing still feels too much like grief. The year was 1882, and the Colorado plains were still wild enough that a man could ride for half a day without seeing another soul. The railroad had come through some parts, and the cattle towns were loud and full of ambition, but out on the grassland between Pueblo and the smaller settlements to the south, the land was mostly silence and wind, and the enormous blue sky that had no patience for human hesitation. Seth Finley was 26 years old, broad in the shoulder, lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled at the ends when the weather was humid and eyes the color of creek water in summer. Not quite green, not quite brown, something in between that changed depending on the light. He had his father's jaw and his mother's mouth, which meant he looked serious when he was thinking and surprisingly open when he smiled, and he did not smile often enough for people to see the difference. His father, Elias Finley, had died 14 months ago, a fever that came on fast and took him in 10 days, which was the kind of death the frontier was famous for: swift, indifferent, without ceremony. Elias had built the ranch from nothing over 30 years, had bought the land when Seth was not yet born, and had worked it through drought and blizzard and the terrible cattle panic of the late 70s. He had left it to Seth because Seth was his only son, and because there was no one else, and because Elias had believed in the land the way some men believe in God, not always able to explain the faith, but never once doubting it. Seth had received the inheritance, thanked the attorney in Pueblo, and then ridden away from it. He told himself it was because the ranch needed work before anyone could live on it. The main house had a collapsed section of roof. The well needed cleaning. The fences along the southern pasture had been let go since Elias got sick. He told himself he was saving money, preparing, getting ready. He told himself a lot of things that were mostly true but not entirely true, and the part that was not true was the part he never looked at directly. He had not been able to make himself walk onto that land knowing his father was not on it. That was the simple truth of it, and it was a truth he had no good answer for. He rode into the town of Millhaven on a Tuesday in October, 1882, when the aspens on the hillsides had gone bright gold, and the mornings had started carrying a real bite. Millhaven was a small town, not prosperous but not failing either, the kind of place that had a general store, a livery, a post office, a church with a leaning steeple, and a saloon that doubled as the hotel when travelers needed a room. There were maybe 200 people in and around Millhaven, most of them ranchers and their families, a few homesteaders, a Chinese laundry run by a man named Ho who had been in Colorado longer than most of the white settlers and was treated considerably worse for it. Seth came to Millhaven because he had heard from a rancher outside Pueblo that there was a woman there who ran the feed and supply store, and that she was hiring someone to drive a wagon load of winter supplies out to the outlying ranches. It was not glamorous work, but it paid fair, and Seth needed fair pay. He needed it because he was, finally, starting to admit to himself that he could not keep riding forever, and that the folded deed in his saddlebag represented something he was eventually going to have to face. He tied his horse, a gray quarter horse he called Banner, in front of the general store and went inside to ask about the supply work. The woman behind the counter was not what he expected. He had expected someone older. He was not sure why the rancher had not described her, had only said the woman who runs the store, but he had assumed someone middle-aged, practical, maybe a widow with grown children. What he found instead was a young woman of perhaps 23, with dark red hair pinned up in a practical knot at the back of her neck, a few strands escaping along her jaw. She was wearing a canvas apron over a brown dress, and she was in the middle of writing something in a ledger, and she did not look up when he came in. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said, without looking up. Seth waited. He looked around the store, which was well organized and fully stocked, bolts of cloth on one wall, hardware on another, dry goods down the center, a rack of harness near the back door. Whoever ran this store knew what they were doing. "All right," the woman said, closing the ledger. "What can I help you with?" She looked up at him, and he felt the full attention of her eyes, which were gray and direct, and not unfriendly, but not particularly warm either. The eyes of someone who had learned to assess quickly and waste very little time on unnecessary conversation. "Seth Finley," he said. "I heard you were looking for someone to drive the winter supply runs." "Georgia Garner," she said, and she came around the counter to look at him more fully, which he found slightly disconcerting in its directness. "You from around here? Number outside Pueblo originally. I've been riding work for the past year." "What kind of work?" "Cattle driving, fencing, whatever needs doing." "Can you handle a team of 4 in mountain terrain?" "Yes." "Have you done supply runs before?" "I've driven plenty of freight wagons." Georgia Garner looked at him for a moment longer, the way a person looks when they are deciding whether the words match the man. Then she nodded once. "I've got a load going out Friday morning to 7 ranches. It's 2 days out and 2 back depending on weather. I pay $3 a run plus meals. I've got 3 runs between now and when the snow closes the passes." "That's fair," Seth said. "It is," she agreed, without particular pride in it, just statement of fact. "Can you start Friday?" "I can start Friday." She held out her hand and he shook it, and her grip was firm and brief. "Come by Thursday evening and I'll show you the route and the load manifest," she said. "Board is 2 bits a night at the saloon if you need a room." He did need a room, so he went and got one. He spent the rest of Tuesday getting Banner settled at the livery and walking the town, getting a sense of it the way he always did when he came somewhere new. He ate supper at the saloon, a bowl of beef stew that was mostly beans but was hot and filling, and he listened to the talk around him. Millhaven was a town with its share of worries. The winter was shaping up to be hard. The old-timers were reading the signs and saying so. A rancher named Duluth Crane had been buying up land along the southern creek beds, and people were not happy about it, because Crane was the kind of man who bought land not to use it but to control it, and controlling the creek meant controlling water, which meant controlling everything. There was some concern about a group of men who had been seen riding through the area, not outlaws exactly, but not working cowboys either, the kind of men who got hired to do the things that respectable ranchers could not do openly. Seth listened to all of this and stored it away, the way you did in a new place. He also found himself thinking about Georgia Garner, which was not something he had anticipated. He thought about the directness of her gaze and the efficiency of her manner, and the fact that she had organized that store with the kind of care that spoke of both intelligence and pride. He thought about her red hair and the escaped strands along her jaw, which he told himself was just the kind of thing a man noticed, and did not mean anything particular. Thursday evening he went back to the store. Georgia was behind the counter again, but the store was closed, and she had spread a hand-drawn map on the counter and set the load manifest beside it. She walked him through the route with precision, naming the ranches and their owners, noting which roads were rough, which creek crossing had been washed out and needed to go wide, which rancher would want to be approached from the south end of his property because his dogs were trained on the north side. She had made notes in the margins of the map in small, clear handwriting. "You've done this a while," Seth said, looking at the level of detail in the notes. 3 years, she said. "My father started the store. He passed 2 years ago and left it to me." Seth looked up at her. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said simply. No performance of grief, but something real and steady in her face that told him it was still present in her, just carried quietly. "You run it alone." I have a boy who helps with loading, and Ho from the laundry helps me with the books once a month. But mostly, yes. Seth looked at the map again, looked at the 7 ranches marked on it, thought about the road distances and the terrain. That's a good deal of responsibility, he said. It is, she said, and she said it the same way she said everything, plainly, without complaint, without asking for admiration. Can you handle the route? Yes, he said. Good. She rolled the map and handed it to him along with the manifest. Wagon leaves at first light Friday. I'll have it loaded by the time you get there. He was there at first light. The wagon was loaded and the team already hitched 4 sturdy bays, well matched and clearly used to one another. Seth checked the harness out of habit, and Georgia appeared at the back of the wagon doing the same with the load ropes, and he thought with some amusement that they had both apparently decided to verify the other's work before trusting it. She caught him smiling when she came around front. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You check the ropes. I always check the ropes. I always check the harness. She looked at him for a moment, and then something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one held back. Well, she said, good. He drove out as the sun was climbing the eastern sky, the aspens throwing golden light in long slants across the road, and the cold air sharp and clean in his lungs. Banner was tied behind the wagon, trailing easy. The load was mostly flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, a few crates of tools and hardware, and several bolts of heavy winter cloth that had come in on the last rail delivery. The first day was good. The roads were dry, the team handled well, and Seth found his way to the first 4 ranches without trouble. The ranchers were glad to see the wagon. You could see it in the way they came out of their houses quickly, the kind of relief that came with knowing the winter pantry would be stocked before the passes closed. He unloaded methodically, had each rancher sign the manifest, collected payment where it was owed or noted credit where the arrangement was credit, exactly as Georgia had instructed him. At the 3rd ranch, a spread run by a man named Ed Calloway and his wife, Mrs. Calloway pressed a plate of fried cornbread and bacon into his hands and asked about Georgia. How's that girl doing? Mrs. Calloway asked with the warmth of someone who had watched a young woman take on more than she should have had to. Seems to be doing well, Seth said. Store's well stocked. She works too hard, Mrs. Calloway said, half to herself. Her father was a good man, Frank Garner, knew how to work hard without letting it swallow him whole. I worry she doesn't know the difference yet. Seth thought about that as he drove on. He thought about it more than he expected to. The second day took him higher, into ranches that sat in the foothills and required more careful driving. The road to the 6th ranch climbed a switchback that had one bad turn where the mountain dropped away sharply on the left, and he took it slow and steady, and the team, to their credit, did not spook. The last ranch was a small homestead run by a young couple who could not have been much older than he was, and they were obviously nervous about the winter, and obviously relieved to see the supplies. And the wife had a baby on her hip who regarded Seth with enormous solemn eyes, and Seth gave the baby a piece of hard candy from his pocket, and the baby accepted it with great ceremony. He drove back into Millhaven on Saturday evening with an empty wagon and a signed manifest, and a head full of the land he had been riding through, which was beautiful land, the kind that made you understand why people came here and why they stayed. Georgia was still in the store when he pulled up, the lantern lit against the early dark, and she came out to meet him when she heard the wagon. Any trouble? She asked. Washout at Garfield Creek was worse than your notes said. Went wider. She nodded. I'll update the map, get you paid. She went inside and came back with $3 silver, and she put them in his hand directly, not dropping them on a counter, not making a ceremony of it either, just placing them there with the same practical directness that seemed to characterize everything she did. Second run is 2 weeks from Monday, she said. You still in? I'm still in, he said. Those 2 weeks, Seth stayed in Millhaven. He helped Ed Calloway with a fence repair for a few days, took some work at the livery, and spent his evenings at the saloon, but not drinking heavily. He was not a man who drank heavily, by inclination and by discipline. He got to know some of the town, and the town got used to him. He also got to know Georgia Garner, or began to, which was a slow process because she was not a woman who opened easily. But they shared a counter on several occasions when he came into the store for supplies, and he found that she had opinions about things that she would offer if asked and occasionally when not asked, and that her opinions were usually both sharp and correct, and that she had a dry sense of humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. One afternoon he came in for a new pair of work gloves and found her in a heated negotiation with a drummer trying to sell her a stock of patent medicine that she clearly did not want. Guaranteed to cure dyspepsia, ague, and low spirits, the drummer was saying, with the particular energy of a man who had given this speech many times. My customers don't need curing, Georgia said. They need flour and nails. Good day. The drummer looked at Seth in the way that men sometimes look at each other over a woman's authority, the way that invites complicity. Seth looked back at him without complicity. She said good day, Seth said. The drummer gathered his case and left. Georgia did not thank Seth, but she gave him the work gloves without charge, which he understood to be the same thing. He began to find reasons to stop by the store that were not strictly necessary, and he knew this about himself, and it did not particularly alarm him, though it surprised him a little. He had not been susceptible to a woman's presence in some time. There had been someone in Pueblo, 2 years before his father's death, a schoolteacher named Clara who had been kind and lovely, and whom he had not been able to give what she deserved because he had not been in a position to give anything to anyone. But Georgia was different, not just from Clara, but from the way he had thought about women in general. There was something about her that did not ask for anything, that simply existed with full self-possession, and he found that more compelling than he had anticipated anything being. He was careful. He was careful because he was not a man who acted on feeling before he understood it, and because he had enough self-awareness to know that he was not in a simple or uncomplicated state of mind, carrying around an inherited ranch he could not make himself enter. 11 days after the first supply run, Seth was helping Georgia stack a delivery of canned goods that had come in on a freight wagon from Pueblo, and they were working with the comfortable efficiency of two people who had gotten used to each other's physical presence when Georgia said, without looking up from the crate she was unpacking, I heard you have land outside of town. Seth went still for just a moment. Then he kept stacking cans. South of here, yes, about 12 miles. The Finley place, she said. Ed Calloway mentioned it, said your father had it for years. That's right. She looked at him then with those direct gray eyes. But you're not living on it. No. She waited in the way that she never pushed, but she waited, and the waiting had a quality to it that was more compelling than pushing would have been. It needs work, he said. The main house has a section of collapsed roof. That can be fixed, she said. The well needs cleaning. Also fixable, he looked at her. You have a point you're working toward. Ed Calloway said it's good grazing land, some of the best in this part of the county, and it's just sitting there. I know what it is, he said, more quietly than he intended. She did not back off from the quiet tone. She just looked at him steadily. What are you waiting for? She asked. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He thought of several things to say about the roof, about the well, about needing capital to restock the cattle, about the winter being a bad time to start. He thought of all the things he had been telling himself for 11 months, and standing there with Georgia Garner looking at him with her direct, patient gaze, every one of those things turned thin in his mind, like paper held to a lamp. He did not have a good answer. I don't know, he said, which was the most honest thing he had said about it to anyone, including himself. She nodded, as if this was neither surprising nor particularly troubling, just a fact that had now been established. She went back to unpacking the crate. The Calloway boy knows how to roof, she said. His name is Henry, he's 17, he does good work. And I know where you can get a good water pump at reasonable price, better than cleaning the old well. Seth stared at her. Why would you? Because good land going to waste is a genuine shame, she said. And because I like to know that the outlying properties are viable. It's good for my business if the ranchers are doing well." She paused. "Also because you seem like a man who needs someone to tell him what he already knows." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that something you make a habit of?" For the first time she gave him a full smile, and it changed her face so completely that he had to recalibrate everything he thought he knew about her. It was warm and a little wicked and entirely genuine. "Only when it's warranted," she said. That night, Seth sat on the edge of his cot in the saloon room and took the deed out of his saddlebag. He unfolded it on his knee and looked at it in the lamplight. The handwriting was the attorney's, precise and legal. But his father's name was on it, and his own name below it, and the description of the land, all 300 acres of it, with its creek and its pasture, and its stands of cottonwood along the south fence, was written out in meticulous detail. He thought about his father. He thought about Elias Finley waking up before dawn every day for 30 years to work that land. The way Elias had known every fence post and every water source and every patch of grass. The way he had talked about the land not as property, but as a place he was responsible for, a thing alive that needed tending. He thought about the last time he had seen his father, 3 weeks before the fever, when Elias had been already thinning but still working, still moving through that land with the ease of a man in his own element. The grief was there, full and real, not softened by the 11 months of riding. He had just been moving fast enough not to sit still with it. And here he was, sitting still with it, and it hurt the way he had known it would hurt. But Georgia Garner had asked him what he was waiting for, and he did not have a good answer, and that meant there was no reason left to wait. He was at the land the following morning. He tied Banner to the old hitching post outside the main house, which was still standing solid despite the weather, the post sunk deep and true the way Elias had said it. He stood at the boundary of the property for a long moment before he stepped onto it, the way a man will pause at a threshold when the crossing matters. Then he stepped across. The grass was long and autumn brown, and it whispered against his boots as he walked. The house was in worse shape than he had let himself imagine. The collapsed section of roof on the east side had let in weather, and there was warping and rot in some of the floor beneath it. But the walls were stone and heavy timber, and they were sound. The fireplace was intact. The main structure had bones, the kind of bones that lasted. He walked the whole property that day. He walked the fences, some down, some standing, all of them needing attention but none of them beyond repair. He walked to the creek, which was running clear and cold, one of the best water sources in the county, his father had always said. He walked the north pasture and the south pasture, and stood in the middle of the south pasture where the grass was richest, and looked at the mountains to the west and the long open country to the east, and felt, for the first time in 11 months, as if his feet were on the right ground. He sat down in the middle of the south pasture and he cried, quietly, without drama, the way a man cries when he has been holding something too long and is finally in the place where it is safe to put it down. He cried for his father, and for the years he would not have with him, and for the land that had been handed to him with more love than he had known how to receive. Then he wiped his face and stood up and looked at the house and began thinking practically. He came back to Millhaven in the late afternoon and went straight to the store. Georgia was with a customer, a rancher's wife, picking out fabric, and Seth waited near the door, turning his hat in his hands. When the woman left, Georgia looked at him and apparently read something in his face. "You went," she said. "I went," he said. Something in her expression softened. Not dramatically, not with a rush of sympathy, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that was, from Georgia Garner, the equivalent of another woman throwing her arms around him. "How is it?" she asked. "Needs a lot of work," he said. "The east side of the roof is gone, some floor rot underneath. Fences need attention everywhere. The well is silted up." He paused. "The land is beautiful." "It is," she said. "I've ridden past it." He looked at her. "You said the Callaway boy, Henry, he knows how to roof. I'll introduce you tomorrow if you want." "I want," he said. She introduced him to Henry Callaway the next morning at the Callaway Ranch, and Henry turned out to be a rangy 17-year-old with a startling competence and a quiet manner, and they agreed on wages and a start date of the following Monday. Georgia, who had come along to make the introduction and apparently to inspect the proceedings, did not say much during the negotiation, but when it was done, she gave Seth a small nod that meant she approved, and Seth found he cared about that small nod more than he should have. In the weeks that followed, the Finley place began to come back to life. Seth worked from first light to last light, and Henry came out 4 days a week to work on the roof. 2 ranchers who had been friends with Elia's Ed Calloway and a man named Tom Reeves came out one Saturday with their hands and spent the day helping with fences, refusing payment, saying only that Elia's had helped them both in their early years, and it was right to help his son. Seth was moved by this more than he let show, and he fed them all a midday meal of beans and cornbread, and they ate together in the autumn sun, and talked the way men talk when work has been done well. Georgia came out once about 3 weeks in on a Monday when the store was closed. She closed Mondays, and she arrived in her small wagon with a load of supplies he had not asked for but clearly needed: window glass, a supply of lime for the walls, a set of hinges for the back door that had dropped on its frame. "How much?" he asked, when she set the last box down. "Consider it an investment," she said. "If you're stocking from my store this winter, you'll make it back for me." "I'll be stocking from your store this winter," he said, and something in the way he said it made her glance at him sideways, because it was not purely commercial and they both knew it. She stayed for most of the afternoon. She helped him hang the new hinges, which required holding the door at exactly the right angle while he drove the screws, and they worked with their heads close together for a while and did not say much, but the proximity was not uncomfortable. It was, if anything, the most comfortable Seth had felt in the presence of another person in a long time. When the door swung true and he tested it twice, she said, "Good," and he said, "Good," and they looked at each other standing in the doorway of his father's house, the late afternoon light coming in gold and long behind her, and he thought, there it is. The thing he had not quite named yet but could no longer pretend he did not feel. He did not act on it. It was too soon, and the circumstance was too tangled. He was still finding his footing on this land, still in the process of becoming the man who lived here rather than the man who was afraid to. He was not willing to reach toward Georgia Garner until he was standing on solid ground, but he was building that ground. The second supply run went out on a Monday in late October, and this time Georgia rode with him. She had not mentioned doing so, and he had not expected it, but she appeared at the wagon on Monday morning with her own horse saddled and tied behind, and she said she had a delivery disagreement to sort out at the Harmon Ranch that she preferred to handle herself, and she would ride along. He was glad. He was more glad than was quite casual, and he tried to hold that lightly. They rode out in the early cold, their breath coming in small clouds, and Georgia had a wool scarf around her neck and her hat pulled down, and she sat her horse the way a woman who had grown up around horses sits a horse, easy and natural. They talked some, and were quiet some, and the quiet was comfortable. He told her about some of the property work, and she told him about the trouble with Duluth Crane, which was getting more serious. "He's offered to buy me out twice," she said, "store and the parcel of land behind it. Have you told him no?" "I've told him no clearly twice. Last week one of his men came in and spent 20 minutes explaining to me that running a store alone was too much for a woman, and that Mr. Crane's offer was very generous." Seth looked at her steadily. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that Mr. Crane could keep his offer and his opinion and see himself out." "Good," Seth said. "He's buying up water rights along the Southern Creek," she said. "You should know that because part of that creek runs through your property." Seth had not thought of this. He felt a cold clarity cut through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What does he own so far?" "He's got deeds on 3 parcels that border the upper creek. If he gets 2 more, he'll effectively control the summer flow. Most of the small ranchers in this valley depend on that water." Seth was quiet for a while, thinking, who else knows this? Ed Calloway knows. Tom Reeves knows. Some of the others don't understand what it means yet. And Crane is moving quietly, buying through intermediaries so the full picture isn't obvious until it's done. We should call a meeting, Seth said. Georgia looked at him. You've been on that land 3 weeks and you're ready to take on Duluth Crane. I've been on that land 3 weeks and I already know I'm not selling any of it to anyone, he said. If he's threatening the water rights, that's something the ranchers in this valley need to know and need to act on together. Georgia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I've been thinking the same thing. I wasn't sure any of the men would listen to it coming from me. Then it comes from both of us, Seth said. She gave him a look that was appraising and something else, something that had warmth in it, real warmth, and she nodded. The delivery to the Harmon Ranch went cleanly, Georgia handling the dispute with the same directness she brought to everything, and then they continued to the other ranches on the route. That evening they camped at a place Georgia knew, a flat shelf of ground above a creek with good firewood nearby and a natural windbreak of pines. Seth built a fire and they heated beans from a can and drank coffee and sat across the fire from each other in the darkening evening. The stars over Colorado in late October were extraordinary, the sky absolutely clear and cold, and the stars thick as scattered salt across it. Seth looked up at them and felt something in his chest that was not grief and not longing but something older and more settled, like the beginning of gratitude. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Georgia looked at him across the fire. "You can ask. What made you stay? After your father died, you could have sold the store and gone somewhere easier." She was quiet for a moment, the firelight moving across her face. "Easier isn't the same as better," she said. "This is where I grew up. These are my people, even the ones who underestimate me, which is most of them." A small, dry note in that. "My father built something here, something useful. I wasn't going to let that go just because it was hard." "You loved him," Seth said. "Very much," she said, without flinching from it. "And he trusted me with what he'd built, which felt like two things at once, an enormous gift and an enormous responsibility. Still does." Seth nodded slowly. "I know something about that." She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. They were quiet together then, the fire between them, the enormous dark sky above, and the silence had the quality of two people who have moved past the early stage of not knowing each other and arrived somewhere more substantial. "Your father would be glad," Georgia said after a while, "that you went back." Seth looked into the fire. "I think so too," he said. "I think he'd have had something sharp to say about taking 11 months to do it." "Grief doesn't run on anyone else's schedule," she said. He looked up at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They rode back into Millhaven the next afternoon, the wagon empty and the manifest signed, and Seth paid for 2 coffees at the saloon, and they sat at the corner table and worked out the details of calling the ranchers' meeting. Georgia knew who needed to be there and had a better sense of who would and would not be reliable, and Seth had the land deed and the legal understanding of water rights that he had been mulling over, and together they drew up a plan that was more complete than either of them could have made alone. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening in the church hall, which was the only building in Millhaven large enough to hold the 22 people who showed up. Seth had ridden out personally to 4 of the ranches to make sure the word got out, and Georgia had spoken to people who came through the store. Duluth Crane was not there, but Seth had not expected him to be. Seth stood at the front of the hall and laid out what he knew about the water rights, with Georgia beside him with the map and the specific parcel information. There was grumbling and surprise and some argument, particularly from a rancher named McCourt, who did not believe the situation was as serious as Seth was presenting it, and who also clearly did not like taking information from a man who had been in the valley less than 2 months. "You've been here 5 minutes," McCourt said, with the bluntness of a man who had no interest in tact. "He's been here long enough to see what some of us have been too close to see," Ed Calloway said, and that settled McCourt somewhat, because Calloway's opinion carried weight in this valley. By the end of the evening, they had an agreement to hire a lawyer from Pueblo to look at the water rights claims, to pool some money for the legal cost, and to present a united front to any further offers from Crane or his men. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a start, and a start was more than they had walked in with. Afterward, Georgia stood outside the church in the cold night air, and Seth came to stand beside her. "Good meeting," she said. "Good map," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, not the restrained almost smile he had been seeing. It was brief and bright, and it did something irreversible to his chest. "McCourt will come around," she said. "He just has to be the last one to agree to everything. It's a personality trait." I noticed. They stood in the cold together, the town around them quiet, a few lanterns still burning in the saloon windows. "Georgia," he said, and something in the way he said her name made her turn to look at him fully. "Seth," she said, and there was a note in her voice that was almost a question, but not quite. He was not eloquent. He was not the kind of man who had pretty speeches ready. He said, "I'd like to take you to supper. Not supply-run supper, not coffee at the saloon. Real supper, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment with that assessing look, but there was warmth beneath it now, clear and unmistakable. "I'm willing," she said. He took her to supper on Saturday, at the only real restaurant in Millhaven, which was actually a room in the back of the general store, operated by a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who cooked exceptionally well, and served at a proper table with a cloth on it. It was not a grand establishment, but it was the best Millhaven had to offer, and Seth had shaved carefully and worn his better shirt, and Georgia arrived in a dark green dress he had not seen before, her red hair down around her shoulders in a way that he had also not seen before, and that made him stop and forget what he was going to say for a moment. "You look very fine," he said, which was simpler than what he was thinking but was at least true. "So do you," she said, without any of the coyness that some women used, just a plain, warm statement, and he liked her for it. Mrs. Hargrove had made roasted chicken and potatoes, and there was fresh bread, and they ate slowly and talked, and it was easy in the way that things are easy when two people have done the work of getting to know each other and arrived somewhere real. He told her about his father. Not the surface version, not just the facts of the inheritance, but the deeper version. What Elias had been like, the way he had taught Seth to read land and read weather, the stories Elias had told about the early years when the ranch was nothing, and he had built it by himself with tools and stubbornness. He told her about the last conversation he had had with his father, which had been ordinary and short, and not the conversation he would have wanted it to be, but which he had come to accept as what it was. Georgia listened. She was a good listener, attentive without being performative about it, asking questions that showed she had understood what he said. And then she told him about her own father, Frank Garner, who had come to Colorado from Ohio with nothing but a wagon full of dry goods, and the conviction that where people were settling, a good store would always be needed. She told him about growing up behind the counter, learning to read invoices before she could read books, learning to talk to ranchers and miners and homesteaders, and the handful of Eastern visitors who came through with their strange clothes and their stranger assumptions about the West. She told him about Frank's death, a fall from a ladder while he was fixing a sign, a quick and stupid accident, and the way she had found out, and the weeks after that had been mostly a matter of keeping moving so she did not stop. "You didn't sell," Seth said. "I didn't sell," she confirmed. "And you've been here running it alone." "I have." He looked at her across the table in the warm light of Mrs. Hargrove's candles. "That took a great deal of courage," he said. "It took stubbornness," she said, but she was pleased, and she let herself be pleased, and that openness, that small drop in the careful guard, was more intimate to him than anything else could have been. He walked her back to the small house attached to the back of the store that she lived in, and at the door he stopped and she stopped, and they stood in the cold dark, very close. "Can I do this again?" he asked. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," she said. He wanted to kiss her. He thought she knew that, and he thought from the way she was looking at him that she was not opposed to it, but he also thought, not yet. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt like something to be earned, and he was not quite there. He was getting there. "Good night, Georgia," he said. "Good night, Seth," she said, and she went inside, and he stood in the cold for a moment longer, feeling more alive than he had in a long time. The weeks that followed were good weeks. The roof on the main house was finished in the first week of November. Henry Calloway's work clean and solid. And Seth moved in properly, bringing his few belongings from the saloon room and arranging them in the house that now felt like his house, rather than a place he was visiting. He bought a new pump for the water supply, installed with help from Tom Reeves, and the clean cold water coming up through it was one of the more satisfying things he had experienced in a long time. He started buying a small cattle herd, beginning with 20 head from a rancher who was downsizing, negotiating a fair price and trailing them back to his property himself. The South pasture had held cattle for 30 years. It knew what to do. The cattle settled quickly, and he rode the fence lines every other day, fixing and reinforcing, Banner knowing the circuit now and moving along it with the calm of a horse who understands the work. He and Georgia fell into a rhythm. He came to town 2 or 3 times a week for supplies or to deliver something from the ranch in trade eggs once his chickens were established, a side of beef from the first steer he butchered. She came out to the ranch on her closed Mondays sometimes, and they worked on things together or just walked the property while he pointed out what was done and what was still to do. He had taken to explaining the land to her the way his father had explained it to him, with attention and specificity, and she listened and asked questions and seemed to genuinely find it interesting. One Monday in mid-November she stood in the south pasture with him, the mountains bright with early snow to the west, the cattle grazing in the middle distance, and she said, "Your father chose well." "He did," Seth said, and then because he was in the habit of honesty with her now, "I think I was afraid that if I came here and started to love it I would lose him more fully, like I'd be replacing him." Georgia turned to look at him. "Is that how it feels?" "No," he said, and he was surprised by how clearly he knew this. "It feels like the opposite, like being here keeps him present." She reached out and touched his arm just briefly, just a moment of warm pressure through his coat sleeve, and then withdrew her hand. But the touch was there. He looked at her. The wind moved her hair across her face, and she tucked it back with a gesture that was so unremarkable and so completely itself, and he thought, "This is the woman I want to sit across from for the rest of my life." He knew it the way he knew land, not through deliberation but through a kind of recognition, the way you know good pasture when you see it, the way you know water when you feel it underfoot. He did not say it that day. He continued to learn her, continued to let the thing between them grow at its own pace, not rushing it. But he knew. The trouble with Duluth Crane came to a head in late November. Crane sent a man to the Finley ranch on a Wednesday, a heavy-shouldered man named Boswell who arrived without invitation and dismounted in front of Seth's main house with the ease of someone who was accustomed to walking into other people's situations. Seth was mending harness on the porch when he arrived, and he set the harness down and waited. "Mr. Crane would like to make you an offer on the creek parcel," Boswell said. "The western 12 acres along the water, generous price." "Not for sale," Seth said. "He thought you might say that," Boswell said. "He asked me to tell you that it'd be in your interest to reconsider, given that this is your first winter here and it's shaping up to be a hard one, and new ranchers sometimes find they need friends in the valley." The implicit threat was not particularly subtle, but it was not overt enough to be actionable. Seth recognized the approach. It was the approach of a man who had enough power to be casual about it. "Tell Mr. Crane that this is my father's land and my land now," Seth said, "and that I'm not new to this valley. I was born into this valley. And tell him that the ranchers in this county have hired a lawyer from Pueblo to look at the water rights claims, so any further acquisitions should expect scrutiny." He picked up the harness again. "That's my answer." Boswell looked at him for a long moment. Then he mounted and rode away. Seth rode to town that afternoon and told Georgia, and she was unsurprised but grave. "He sent a similar man to see McCourt last week," she said. McCourt told him to get off his land, which is the most I've ever respected McCourt. The lawyer from Pueblo arrived the following week and spent several days examining deeds and talking to ranchers, and his conclusion was that Crane's acquisitions were legal, but that the specific water rights for the creek were governed by a prior claim dating to the original Colorado territorial settlement, which meant that any downstream users had protected rights regardless of who owned the land above. It was not a complete victory. Crane still owned 3 parcels and could do certain things with them, but it was enough to stop the immediate threat to the valley's water supply, and when the lawyer presented his findings at a second meeting in the church hall, the mood was considerably lighter than the first meeting had been. McCourt, who had finally come fully around, shook Seth's hand at the end of the meeting with the grip of a man who does not shake hands lightly. "Your father was a good man," McCourt said. "Looks like you're going to be one too." Seth thought about those words walking back to the saloon that night. He had not moved back to the ranch yet for the winter supply trip preparation, and he felt the quiet, deep pleasure of them, the sense of being placed, of belonging somewhere. He thought about how long it had taken him to find his way to this ground, and how much he wished it had not taken so long, and how grateful he was that it had not taken longer. He went to Georgia's store the next morning early, before she opened, and knocked at the door of her house instead of the store door. She answered it quickly, already dressed, already herself, and she looked at him with the slight lift of an eyebrow that meant she was curious and not yet sure what this was. "Come for a walk with me," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Let me get my coat," she said. They walked out of town along the creek path, the morning frost on the grass, their breath clouding, the town behind them and the open country ahead. He had thought about what he wanted to say and decided against saying anything prepared, because prepared things were not what Georgia Garner responded to. She responded to honesty. "I've been thinking about you since about 2 weeks after I got here," he said. She looked at him sideways, something careful and warm simultaneously in her expression. "I've been thinking about you for longer than I should have been," he said, "given that I was still trying to figure out how to be a man worth knowing. But I think I know what I'm doing now. I know where I am. And I know what I want, which is to court you properly if you're willing. To tell you directly that I'm interested in more than supply runs and water rights meetings." She was quiet for a moment, the creek beside them running silver and quiet in the cold morning. "I know what you're interested in," she said finally. "I've known for a while." "And," he said. She stopped walking and turned to face him. The morning sun was coming up over the eastern plain and it lit her face and her hair, and she looked at him with all of her characteristic directness and all of the warmth she usually kept more carefully contained. "And yes," she said, "I'm interested in more too." He kissed her then, finally, standing on the frost-white grass beside the creek with the November sun coming up around them, and it was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of 2 people who had been taking their time deliberately and were now done taking their time. Her hands came up and held his face, and he had his arms around her, and the creek ran on beside them indifferent and clear. When they drew back, she looked at him with her eyes bright. "You took your time," she said. "I was waiting until I was worth it," he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between amusement and exasperation. "Seth Finley," she said, "you were worth it the day you walked into my store." He smiled, the full smile that people did not see often enough to know, and her face responded to it, the way faces respond to something they have been hoping to see. They walked back to town hand in hand, and if the people of Millhaven noticed, and they did, and if they talked about it, and they did, Georgia Garner and Seth Finley did not especially mind. The third supply run was the last one before the passes closed, and they did it together again, and it had an entirely different character now, still efficient, still practical, but layered with something that made the cold days warm and the long night at the campsite on the creek shelf, something that Seth knew he would remember for the rest of his life. They sat beside the fire and she leaned into him, and he had his arm around her, and they talked about everything and nothing, about the plans for the ranch and the plans for the store and the kind of future that two capable, stubborn people could build in a valley they both belonged to. "You should have more cattle by spring," she said. "I'm planning on it. I was thinking about approaching the Reynolds Ranch about a breeding arrangement." "Good idea. Reynolds Bull is the best bloodline in the county." He smiled into the fire. "You know the bloodlines. I supply half the feed in the county. I know everything." "You do," he agreed, and he meant it. The winter settled over Millhaven and the Finley Ranch in earnest after that, and Seth worked through it the way his father had taught him to work through Colorado winters, steadily, without drama, keeping the cattle fed and the fires burning and the work moving forward even on the hard days when the cold came through the walls despite everything. He had the ranch to a functional state now, the house solid and warm, the water system working, the fences holding. It was not the full ranch it had been when Elias was in his prime, but it was beginning. Georgia was in town, 12 miles away, and he rode in twice a week on decent weather days, and she came out on Mondays. And the time apart was filled with thinking about her, and the time together was filled with conversation and work, and the easy physical comfort of two people who liked each other and were learning to say so. She stayed for supper once and they ate at the table in the main house, the one his father had built, and she looked around the house with the eyes of someone who was really looking, taking in the details. The books on the shelf that had been Elias, the coat hook by the door that was carved from a single piece of cottonwood, the stone fireplace with the deep mantel where Elias had kept his pipe, and a few river stones he had collected over the years. "He was a careful man," Georgia said. "He was," Seth said. "He liked things to last." She picked up one of the river stones from the mantel, smooth and pale and oval, the kind of stone a river makes over years of work. "I can feel him in here," she said quietly. Seth looked at her and felt something that was entirely full, not empty, not aching, full, the way a well is full, quiet and ready. "I'm glad," he said. The new year came, 1883, and with it the first signs of real thaw in late February, the snow receding from the south-facing slopes, the creek running high with meltwater. Seth was expanding the herd steadily, had reached 40 head now, and the land was showing signs of what it could be, what it had been, what it would be again. On a Sunday in March, when the first real warmth had come and the cottonwoods along the south fence were budding pale green, Seth rode into Millhaven with a plan he had been building in his head for 2 months. He went to Georgia's store on Sunday when it was closed. He knocked at her house door. She answered it and said, "You look like you're going to say something important." "I am," he said. She stepped back and let him in. They stood in her small, warm kitchen, the coffee pot on the stove, the light coming through the window clear and spring bright. He had the ring in his pocket. It had been his mother's ring, which had been in the bottom of his saddlebag alongside the deed for the past year, and he had cleaned it last week and looked at it for a long time. It was a simple gold band with a small piece of turquoise set in it, the turquoise a deep sky blue. His father had found the stone on the land and had it set by a silversmith in Pueblo as a wedding gift. "I want you to know something," he said. "Not as a preamble to asking you something, just as a thing I want to say first. This land that my father left me, I couldn't walk onto it because I didn't know how to be in the world without him in it. And then you asked me what I was waiting for, and I didn't have a good answer, and that made me realize I'd been waiting for permission, waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to go home. And when you did that, when you asked me that, it changed something." Georgia was very still, looking at him. "I've been building a life on that land," he said, "and I want to build it with you. I want you to be the person who walks that land with me, and who argues with me when I'm being stubborn, and who knows more about the cattle bloodlines than I do, and who has opinions about window glass and hinge quality and the proper organization of a supply manifest." He took the ring out of his pocket. "Georgia Garner, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright and she was not trying to contain it, which was its own kind of thing because she usually contained everything. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady and entirely certain. "Yes, I will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it against her hand, the small turquoise stone sky blue in the morning light. "Your mother's?" she asked. "My father found the stone on the land," he said. "He had it set for her." She closed her hand around it. "Then it belongs here," she said. He kissed her, there in her kitchen with the coffee pot on the stove, and she kissed him back with the full, honest warmth of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it in every part of herself. And it was one of the best moments of his life. They were married in June of 1883 in the Millhaven church with the leaning steeple, which somebody had fixed by then. Tom Reeves' oldest son had taken it on as a project, and the steeple stood properly upright for the occasion, which seemed right. Ed Calloway and his wife were there, and Tom Reeves and his family, and McCourt, who had become grudgingly fond of Seth and less grudgingly fond of Georgia. Henry Calloway, now 18 and growing into a serious young man, stood near the back and looked pleased with himself in the way that people look when something they helped build turns out well. Ho from the laundry, who had helped Georgia with her books and her taxes for 2 years, and who was one of her truest friends in the valley, despite or perhaps because of the ways in which they had both had to fight for their place, sat in the third row and cried without embarrassment. The Reverend was a lean man named Hutchins who had been in Millhaven since its beginning and who married them with brevity and sincerity. And when Seth said, "I do," it was with the completeness of a man who means it in every word. Georgia said, "I do," in her clear, steady voice, and she was wearing a dress she had made herself from the finest cloth in her own store, a warm cream color with small blue flowers, the turquoise ring on her finger, and her red hair was pinned up with a few small white flowers that Mrs. Calloway had insisted on. And she was so entirely herself, so entirely real, that Seth thought no invented version of happiness could have compared to this specific one. They drove back to the Finley ranch together in the wagon after, with Banner trotting alongside, and the summer land was green and warm and open, the cattle in the south pasture, the cottonwoods full along the fence, the house solid and light and ready for them. Georgia stood on the porch with him and looked out at the valley. "This is home," she said. "Yes," he said. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a long time, not needing to say anything, the land spread out before them in the long June light. Georgia kept the store. This had always been understood. She had not built it up for 2 years alone to hand it to someone else, and Seth would never have suggested it. She rode into town 4 days a week, and Seth drove in with her sometimes. And on the days she was in town, he managed the ranch. And on the days she was at the ranch, she helped him think through the plans and the problems, and kept a running inventory of what the ranch needed, and what the store had that could supply it. It was a practical partnership, and it was also a loving one, and the two things fed each other in ways that were easy to see if you paid attention. The summer of 1883 was good. The cattle herd grew. Seth made the arrangement with Reynolds about the breeding bull, and by fall had 60 head, which was a real herd, which was a beginning that felt like something. He had rebuilt the southern fence entirely, the posts set deep and the wire tight, and he had put in a root cellar and repaired the barn and started work on a proper chicken house. The ranch was not what it had been at Elias Peak, but it was on the way there, and it was his in a way that felt earned now. Georgia hired a young man named Peters to help in the store 3 days a week, which gave her more time at the ranch and also freed her to take on the supply runs again, which she had missed. She and Seth did the last fall supply run together, the familiar route now deeply known to both of them, and they drove it in good time in the cool September air and camped at the shelf above the creek the way they always did. And Seth built the fire and Georgia made the coffee, and they sat in the dark together, and he thought, "I could do this forever." The trouble with Duluth Crane did not entirely disappear. Crane had retreated from the water rights strategy after the lawyer's report, but he remained a presence in the county, buying land when he could and using his money to influence things in ways that were never quite direct enough to be legally actionable. There was a period in the fall when his men seemed to be watching the Finley ranch from a distance. Seth noticed them twice on the ridge above the south pasture, but when Seth rode up to confront them, they were gone, and nothing came of it directly. What came of it indirectly was that the ranchers of the valley, brought together by the water rights meeting, maintained the coalition they had formed and made it stronger. They met quarterly now in the church hall, not always with crisis driving the agenda, sometimes just coordinating sharing information about markets, about weather, about land and water, and the various pressures that a small ranching community in 1880s Colorado had to navigate. It was Seth who mostly organized these meetings, having started the practice, but it was Georgia who made them actually function, because she knew everyone and everyone knew her, and she could tell you who needed to be managed and who needed to be listened to and who just needed a cup of coffee before they were capable of agreement. Seth noticed this about her with great admiration and told her so on the ride home from one meeting in October. "You did that," he said. "You had McCourt agreeing to the water schedule before he knew he'd agreed to anything." "McCourt just needs to feel heard before he can hear anyone else," she said. "Once you know that about him, he's easy." "You know what everyone needs," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know what they're afraid of mostly. That's the same thing as what they need." He looked at her riding beside him in the October evening light, and the ring was on her finger and her name was Finley now, Georgia Finley, though she kept the store sign as Garner's Supply because it had been her father's and she would not change it, and he thought, "This woman is extraordinary and she does not know how extraordinary she is, or she knows and she doesn't make a fuss about it, which is itself extraordinary." "Georgia," he said. She looked at him. "I love you," he said. It was not the first time he had said it. He had said it on their wedding day and a handful of times since, always meaning it, always finding the saying of it inadequate to what he actually felt. But she always received it the same way, not with performance, just with the truth. "I love you too," she said, "very much." In November of 1883, Georgia told Seth she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Monday morning plainly, sitting across the breakfast table from him with her coffee in her hands. He sat very still for a moment. Then, "When?" "May, I think, maybe June." He stood up and came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he looked up at her face, and she was watching him with an expression that was open and careful in equal parts, because this was enormous and new and neither of them had a map for it. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I'm well," she said. "I've been tired, but that's supposed to happen." "Mrs. Calloway will know about it," he said, and then felt immediately uncertain about whether that was the right thing to say. Georgia laughed. "Yes, Mrs. Calloway will know about it. She's the best person to know about it. She's had 6 children, and she's generally the first person I'd ask about anything." He rested his forehead against her hands for a moment. He was trying to contain something very large and finding the containment insufficient. "This is our land," he said, half to himself. "It is," she said. "The baby will be born on Finley land. If we stay out of town long enough, yes." He looked up at her and she was smiling, and he stood up and brought her to her feet and held her with care, the way you hold something that is suddenly more precious than it was before, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the kitchen of his father's house, their house, with the morning light coming through the windows and the sound of the cattle in the south pasture, and the whole wide open country outside. The winter that year was easier than the old-timers had predicted, which was a mercy given that Georgia was carrying. She kept working at the store through January and February, slowing somewhat in March when the tiredness was heavier, and Seth drove her into town and back rather than letting her make the ride alone, which she tolerated with only occasional protests about being capable of managing herself. He knew she was capable. He drove her anyway. She let him, which was its own form of love. Mrs. Calloway did know about it, and was a constant and invaluable presence, visiting the ranch on what seemed like a genuinely helpful schedule and telling Seth, on one occasion when Georgia was out of earshot, "She's strong and she's healthy and she's going to be fine, and the best thing you can do is be steady, which you are, so everything will be all right." Seth had not realized he needed to hear this until he heard it. He thanked Mrs. Calloway with more sincerity than the words quite conveyed. The baby came on the 20th of May, 1884, on a morning when the meadowlarks were loud and the cottonwoods were fully leafed out, and it was a boy. They named him Elias Frank Finley, Elias for Seth's father, Frank for Georgia's, and he came into the world with a voice that suggested he had strong opinions about being there, and he had dark hair that curled the way Seth's did and gray eyes that looked directly at the world the way Georgia's did, and he was the most astonishing thing either of them had ever seen. Seth held him in the first hour and could not speak for a while. He just sat in the chair beside the bed where Georgia was resting, holding this new person, this small, heavy, warm bundle that was his son and his father's name, and his wife's eyes, and he understood something about the land that his father had probably understood all along, that you worked it not just for yourself, but for whoever was coming after, that the fences you mended and the cattle you raised and the house you kept sound were for a future you would hand on the way it had been handed to you. Georgia watched him from the bed with tired, bright eyes. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking my father would have loved this," he said. "He would have," she said. "He would have been impossible to contain." Seth looked up at her and she smiled back, and the baby made a small sound and Seth looked down at him, and the smile deepened into something that had no word for it. Little Elias, Eli, they called him, almost immediately grew the way babies in good conditions grow, quickly, loudly, with tremendous investment in being present. He was at the ranch and then at the store, and then wherever his parents were, passed between them with the easy competence of two people who had agreed without discussion on how they would do this. Georgia went back to the store at 6 weeks, which Seth thought was too soon and said so, and she said, "The store doesn't close because I had a baby," and that was the end of that. She brought Eli with her on his first trip to the store at 8 weeks, where Mrs. Ho, who had begun working some hours in the store in an arrangement that benefited everyone and that was the kind of quiet social progress the frontier occasionally made without announcing it, took the baby with visible joy while Georgia got back to work. The store and the ranch together made a solid livelihood, not wealthy, but comfortable and growing. They were in a good position when the second supply route expansion came, Georgia having taken on 2 new ranches farther out that had previously been served from Pueblo at greater expense. Seth helped with the longer runs when he could, and Henry Calloway, now fully grown and running his own small outfit, sometimes drove for them as well. The summer of 1885 was the best year the ranch had so far. Seth had the herd at 120 head, had built a proper second barn, and had gotten the south pasture cross-fenced the way Elias had always intended but never gotten around to. The house had been extended. Seth had added a room on the west side for Eli and a second room that Georgia called the study, where she kept the store accounts, and where Seth kept the ranch books, and where they often sat in the evenings after Eli was asleep, working in companionable quiet. Duluth Crane sold his holdings in the valley in early 1885 and moved on to somewhere else in the territory, which the ranchers heard about without much ceremony and without grief. The community that had formed around the water rights fight continued. It had become something more than a defense. It was a network now, genuinely useful, the kind of thing that made individual ranches more resilient because they were connected to others. Seth continued to run the quarterly meetings, and Georgia continued to be the person who made them actually function. At one meeting in the spring of 1885, when they were discussing the possibility of a shared grazing arrangement for the drought season, McCourt, full of years of warming up to the idea of Seth Finley, said to the assembled ranchers, "This valley is doing better than the ones on either side of us. I'll tell you why. Because we have people who care about it." He looked directly at Seth and Georgia when he said it, which was about as effusive as McCourt ever got, and which Seth acknowledged with a nod and Georgia acknowledged with a look that combined appreciation and amusement in the perfect proportions. On an evening in the fall of 1885, Seth stood on the porch of the main house in the long late light and looked out at the south pasture where the cattle were moving toward the water. The mountains were turning pink and orange to the west. The cottonwoods along the south fence were going gold. The land was full and alive and settled in the way land gets when it has been well tended, when the grasses are healthy and the water is clean and the fences are where they need to be. Georgia came out behind him with Eli on her hip, the boy 2 years old now and full of language and motion, always pointing at things and demanding their names. He pointed at the cattle. "Cows," Seth said. "Cow," Eli agreed solemnly. Georgia came to stand beside Seth and Eli reached for him and Seth took him, the small solid weight of his son in his arm, and put his other arm around Georgia. "Are you happy?" she asked him. He thought about the question the way he thought about all real questions, with actual attention. "Yes," he said, "more than I knew was available." She leaned into him. "I'm going to tell you something," she said. He waited. "We're going to have another one." He turned to look at her. She was watching him with that expression she had, the one he had learned to read completely, the combination of matter-of-factness and concealed delight. "When?" he said. "Spring again," she said. "May or June, the same as Eli." He looked at his son, who was watching a hawk cross the sky with total absorption. He looked at Georgia, who was looking at him with warm gray eyes. He kissed her on the temple, which was what he could reach with a 2-year-old between them, and she laughed a quiet laugh. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she confirmed. The second child was born on the 14th of June, 1886, in the room that had been the study and that Mrs. Calloway had advised them to clear out well in advance, which they did, setting up a proper birthing arrangement with everything Mrs. Calloway specified. The baby was a girl, and she arrived with the same strong opinions as her brother had, and Georgia named her Clara Ruth Finley, Clara for an old friend of Georgia's mother and Ruth for Seth's grandmother, who he had never met but who had come west with Elia's before Seth was born. Clara had Georgia's red hair from the very beginning, a spectacular fact that Georgia observed with satisfaction and Seth observed with delight. Eli received his sister with a mixture of generosity and suspicion that resolved itself over the following weeks into a fierce and protective affection that they would come to understand was simply who Eli was, a child who claimed people as his, and then stood by them absolutely. Seth and Georgia in the evenings after both children were asleep sat in the rebuilt study with the books between them, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and the silence was the most comfortable silence either of them had ever inhabited with another person. He would look up from the ranch ledger sometimes and find her looking at him from the account book, and they would hold each other's gaze for a moment with the full ease of people who know exactly who they are looking at and are glad of it. By 1887, the Finley Ranch was one of the better operations in the county. Not the largest, not the most ambitious, but solidly managed and well regarded, the kind of place that Elias Finley would have recognized as his own work continued and surpassed in some details while being entirely faithful to his original vision. The land was healthy. The cattle were good. The water was clean. Garner's Supply was, by that point, the most reliable store in a 40-mile radius, stocking more variety than when Frank Garner had built it and serving a wider community. Georgia had extended the supply routes, trained 2 permanent drivers, and had begun handling the supply arrangements for a small mining operation to the northwest that added substantially to the business. She had also become something of an informal advisor to the several women in the valley who were running their own operations, homesteaders, a seamstress, Mrs. Ho, who had expanded her own work, and she did this with the same practical, unsentimental care that she brought to everything, helping where help was useful and stepping back when it was not. The injustices of the frontier were not lost on either of them. They had seen enough, in 5 years in this valley, to know that the land they had been given came with advantages that others had not been given, that the law and the community that protected their water rights would not always protect everyone equally, that Ho and his family and the few Chinese men who had stayed in the region after the railroad work were subject to treatment that was uglier than it should have been, and that the Ute people whose land this had originally been had been removed under conditions that no amount of frontier mythology made right. Seth and Georgia talked about these things, not with the luxury of being able to fix them, but with the belief that acknowledging them mattered, and that the small specific choices available to them, treating Ho with full respect and paying him fairly, speaking against the uglier prejudices when they appeared in the valley meetings, raising their children with a clear sense of the cost embedded in the ground they stood on, were choices worth making. On a Sunday in September of 1887, Seth rode the full fence line of the Finley Ranch, the circuit he did every week, all 300 acres of it. He rode it the way his father had ridden it, with attention, checking each post and each gate, reading the grass for signs of overgrazing or disease, watching the creek level, taking the temperature of the land. Banner was gray in the face now, slower on the hills but still steady. Seth had a younger horse as well, a roan he had bred himself, but on Sundays he still took Banner on the fence circuit. It was a matter of loyalty and also habit, and also because Banner seemed to know the circuit better than any map. He came back to the house in the afternoon. Georgia was on the porch with Clara in her lap, reading aloud from a book. Clara was 3 now, and had decided that books were the most important objects in the world, a development both her parents found gratifying. Eli was in the yard doing something complicated with 2 sticks and a bucket that appeared to involve the management of an imaginary cattle operation. Seth dismounted and tied Banner at the post, the same post his father had set, sunk deep and still true, and came up onto the porch. Georgia looked up. She read his face the way she read everything precisely. "Good?" she asked. "Good," he said. He sat down on the porch step and watched Eli run his imaginary ranch and listened to Georgia reading to Clara, the clear afternoon light on everything, the mountains steady to the west, the valley spread out below them in the autumn gold. He took the old deed out of his coat pocket. He had kept it there instead of the saddlebag these past years, a habit he did not intend to change, and held it in his hands for a moment. The creases were soft as cloth now, permanently worn into the paper. His father's name was on it and his own name below it, and the description of the land was the same as it had always been. He folded it and put it back. "Seth," Georgia said. He looked at her over his shoulder. She had Clara on her hip now, the little girl sleepy and heavy against her mother, the red hair tangled with the afternoon wind, and Georgia was looking at him with her gray eyes full of everything she was, the store and the road and the fire and the honesty and the warmth she had always been careful with and now gave freely. "Come inside," she said. "The children are ready for supper." He stood up and went to her, and she let him take Clara, who stirred and resettled against his shoulder with the immediate trust of a child who knows the arms that are holding her. He held his daughter and looked at his wife, and behind them the door of his father's house was open, and inside there was warmth and lamplight and the smell of supper, and the sound of Eli coming in from the yard, and outside there were 300 acres of good Colorado grassland running all the way to the mountains. He had not had a good answer for what he was waiting for. He had not had a good answer because the answer was not something he could have known without going through what he went through, without the year of riding and the folded deed, and the woman who had asked him a direct question in her well-organized store on an October morning, and then looked at him with patient gray eyes and waited. The answer had turned out to be this. He had been waiting to become ready, and readiness had required grief and time and someone who believed in him honestly enough to ask the question he could not ask himself. He had been waiting for Georgia, and Georgia had asked him what he was waiting for, and the land had answered, and here they were. "Coming," he said, and walked through the door into the warmth of everything he had built, everything he had been handed, everything that was finally, thoroughly, and without reservation home.